Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Berechot, Chapter 8, Halacha 1, and this now is going to talk about a lot of disputes between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. Anytime you're learning Gemara, you have to always keep in mind the principle that you can't understand Bet Hillel without understanding Bet Shammai. And it's the same idea. You can't understand Rabbi Yochanan if you're not understanding Rish Lakish. And you can't understand Rava if you don't understand Abaya. You always need to understand the opposite. It's always this way. You need to understand the minority opinion to understand the majority opinion. So you always want to be trying to pay extra attention to the opinion of Bet Shammai and the minority opinion in order to really understand the nuance of Bet Hillel. You don't want to just say, okay, this is what Bet Shammai says, this is what Bet Hillel says. It's going to be Bet Hillel, that's it, move on. You don't want to do that. You want to really understand the mechanism of what is the point of Shammai and what is going to be the point of Hillel, and really understand the mechanism behind it, because it's going to give you a greater understanding of the nuances and details. And you really want to gain that level of specificity in your own learning. Mishnah starts off and says, these are the matters of dispute between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel regarding the law pertaining to a meal. So we were just talking about the laws of Berechot Mazon, and now the Mishnah is going to talk about the protocols for the meal itself. And so now we're going to be actually talking about the meal. Chapter 8 is going to be talking about the meal. So the first dispute talks about the order of Kiddush and the Kiddush blessings that are recited on the Shabbat Eve and the festivals. And the Mishnah says that Bet Shammai says one first recites the blessing over the sanctity of the day, and afterward recites the blessing over the wine. And Bet Hillel says one first recites the blessing over the wine, and afterward recites the blessing over the sanctity of the day. We do Bet Hillel on this, but there's a lot going on here with hefsek. The issue here is always going to be coming up with hefsek. That's going to be the ultimate reason behind the dispute. And the disagreement between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel started with one disagreement, and then it became, in the lifetime of Hillel and Shammai, 4. And then after they died in the Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai era, it became just over 300 debates. And in fact, a lot of the disagreements are not that large, but some of the debates have to do with what do you do after the temple period, and what do you do during the temple period. And so some of that is going to come into play for this. But the Gemara is going to get into the explanation on the dispute in this Mishnah. There's a lot of depth in this. And again, the ultimate idea here is that you always want to avoid a hefsek, because if you end up with a hefsek and you have truma on the table, you always have obligation to guard the truma. That's always a positive commandment, and you always have the negative commandment of not to let it become tameh. And so if you're eating at a table and perhaps, maybe there are some people that are not as learned, perhaps they could contaminate the food or the wine. So that's part of the issue with trying to make sure there's no hefsek. And that's the elegance of Bet Hillel's resolution, is to make sure that it happens as quickly as possible so there's no possibility for contamination. That's why there's also no possibility for a loss of attention and there's no possibility for that you change your kavana or that you get distracted. There's also an elegance to that in the Bet Hillel formulation. So the Gemara says, what is Bet Shammai's reason for saying that one recites the blessing over the sanctity of the day before they say the blessing over the wine? And the Berechot is taught like this. It says, first, because the sanctity of the day is what causes the wine to come. So that's the first point. And the Rashi, in the parallel to Sukkah 51a, says that the cup of wine is brought out before the meal only because of the Shabbos or festival, and it's used for the Kiddush recitation. So that's going to be the idea. And what's the other idea of Bet Shammai? And the Gemara says, and further, because one is already subject to the sanctity of the day before the wine arrives. In other words, that the second reason for Bet Shammai is that you have the sanctity of the day comes first, and just as soon as one has accepted the sanctity of the day on himself, the meal does not begin until after the evening prayers are going to be finished. And what this is effectively saying, says Haredim, is that just as the arrival of the day's sanctity precedes the arrival of the wine, so too its blessing should precede before, should precede the blessing over the wine. That's going to be the idea. In other words, that the blessing over the sanctity of the day should precede the blessing of the wine. Now, let's get into the opinion of Bet Hillel. And the Gemara says, and what is Bet Hillel's reason for saying that the blessing over the wine takes precedence? And the Berechot explains that because the wine is what enables the blessing over the sanctity of the day to be recited. In other words, that when there's no wine, Kiddush is not recited. That's going to be the Rashi in the parallel in 51b in Berechot. Now, Haredim is going to point out that according to an opinion recorded in the Gemara at the end of the last chapter, as interpreted by the Haredim, someone who has no wine may recite the Friday night Kiddush over bread, and the Berechot would thereby be interpreting to mean that the Kiddush cannot be recited without either wine or the substitute being bread. And that's going to be the idea. And the idea is that, says the Rabbeinu Tam, that, the position of the Bavli is going to be the position of the Bavli as well, that, if one is unable to obtain wine, one does not recite Kiddush at all. Instead, he must rely on the recitation of the Friday night Shemona Esrei, which contains a passage relevant to the sanctity of the Shabbos and fulfillment of the biblical requirement to remember the Sabbath day. So that's going to be the idea by the Rabbeinu Tam. Also, the Tosafot has at Pesachim, and so that it would emerge that the Berechot's statement, wine causes the blessing over the sanctity of the day to be said, refers specifically to wine. So the idea by the Haredim is that you don't have either the wine or the substitute bread. The idea by the Rabbeinu Tam is that it's just for the wine and that you dispatch the obligation from the blessing in the Shemona Esrei. So a little bit different over there. Very important to study the Meforshim, understand what's going on. Now, Bet Shammai gives two reasons for their opinion, and Bet Hillel is going to be responding with two reasons of their own. That's going to be, the idea. Now, why does Bet Shammai need two reasons? That's a good question. There's some Meforshim that study that, but the Gemara is going to say that another point, the blessing over the wine, is relatively frequent. Now, the wine can be consumed at any time. The Gemara says, whereas the blessing over the sanctity of the day is not as frequent, since the recitation can only be on the festival or on the Shabbat. And there's a rule. We have a rule in the Halacha that when you have a frequently done action and one that's not as frequent, the frequently done action is going to come first. Now, wine can be drunk anytime during the week, even on the Shabbat and the festival. But you could drink it on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi, Yom Sheni, right? No problem. So therefore, that blessing is going to be more frequent than the blessing of the Kiddush. That's going to be the principle here. Now, the Gemara is going to try to learn a law from this brisa, and Rabbi Yossi says from the words of both Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel regarding the order of the Kiddush blessings, we can derive that with regard to the blessings over wine and Havdalah, all agree that the blessing over the wine takes precedence. And it's going to be that, just the Haredim is pointing out that the Havdalah service is going to be recited over a cup of wine when Shabbat ends or a festival ends. And it's going to have a statement of who separates between holy and mundane. And Rabbi Yossi's holding, says the Haredim, that from the reasons given by both Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel in this brisa, it can be learned that the blessing over the wine precedes the blessing of Hamavdil, according to both of them. So the idea is that there's no disagreement between either of them in Rabbi Yossi's formulation. And usually, Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai will actually end up agreeing on 99.99% of the halachot or the issues. It's always just going to be one small wrinkle that they're going to be disagreeing on. But usually there's no disagreement at all. The Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, it is Bet Shammai's reason for giving precedence to the Kiddush blessing, is Bet Shammai's reason for giving precedence to the Kiddush blessing anything other than the sanctity of the day is what causes the wine to come. So the idea is that, in Kiddush, that serves to honor the sanctity of the day that comes. Havdalah is going to be used to bring in the week, okay? And so the wine in the Havdalah is going to serve to honor the Shabbos or the festival day that's already passed. And it cannot be said that the Havdalah blessing itself is what causes the wine to come. And that's going to be a point there. So what the Gemara is doing is the Gemara is looking at the ending of Shabbat to understand what do we do with this, with the wine. In other words, if part of the difference with understanding all this is going to be, well, does the day bring the wine in, or is it going to be the wine that brings the day in? Well, they're coming and they're saying, let's look at the end of the day. Is it going to be the ending that brings in the wine? Or is it going to be that you have the wine that brings the end? So that's effectively, by looking at the end, they're going to understand the beginning. That's why they're doing it. And the Gemara continues, says here, though it is not the Havdalah blessing per se that causes the wine to come, but rather the sanctity of the departing day, Bet Shammai would agree that the blessing over the wine takes precedence. Now, the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say that, well, the Haredim points out that it's the sanctity of the day, and that is going to be the true mechanism for why the wine comes in the first place, and that, that day has already left. So that's going to be, the point. So the Gemara continues and says, is Bet Hillel's reason for saying that the blessing over the wine precedes the Kiddush blessing anything other than the blessing over the wine is relatively frequent, whereas the blessing over the sanctity of the day is not as frequent? So that's going to be the second reason of Bet Hillel as the primary one for Rabbi Yossi's consideration here. And I'll read it again. So again, this is going to be Bet Hillel's second reason that Rabbi Yossi is bringing in here. He says, and is Bet Hillel's reason for saying that the blessing over the wine precedes the Kiddush blessing anything other than that the blessing over the wine is relatively frequent, whereas the blessing over the sanctity of the day is not as frequent. And the idea, says the Gemara, is that here too, therefore, since the blessing over the wine is relatively frequent, Whereas the Havdalah blessing is not as frequent, the blessing over the wine takes precedence. So Havdalah is said on Motzei Shabbos, or when you finish a festival. And same too, wine you can drink on any day. You can drink it on Yom Sheni, no problem. So effectively, it comes up to be the same thing. So Bet Hillel's reasoning that the more frequent takes precedence applies with regards to Havdalah just as much as it does with Kiddush. That's going to be the logical point. Now, the Gemara is going to bring in an Amarah who draws exactly the opposite conclusion from the Brisa. And this is going to be interesting because this is going to be Rabbi Manna who's going to be bringing it in. Rabbi Manna is one of the later Amorim. So Rabbi Manna says, from the words of both Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel concerning the order of the Kiddush blessings, we can learn that with regards to the blessings over wine and Havdalah, that everyone agrees that the Havdalah blessing takes precedence and comes first. And Bet Shammai's reasoning for giving precedence to the Kiddush blessing is it anything other than that one is already subject to the sanctity of the day before the wine comes. And here too, therefore, since one becomes obligated to recite Havdalah before the wine arrives, the Havdalah blessing takes precedence. And is Bet Hillel's reasoning for saying that the blessing over the wine precedes the Kiddush blessing anything other than that the wine is what enables the blessing over the sanctity of the day to be recited. And here, though, since the wine does not enable the Havdalah blessing to be recited, for in the absence of the wine, Havdalah may be recited over Beur. And Bet Hillel agrees that the Havdalah blessing takes precedence. So, on the basis of this statement that just came, from Rabbi Yossi and from Rabbi Manna, the Gemara is going to bring up this rule, and here's how it resolves it. It says, Rabbi Zera said, from the words of both Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Manna, it can be inferred that we may recite Havdalah without wine, but we may not recite Kiddush except with wine. In other words, that if someone doesn't have wine on Motzei Shabbos, he may not recite Havdalah on Beur, and if he lacks wine on Friday night, he does not recite Kiddush at all. So the Haredim is pointing out that Rabbi Yossi is indicating that he does not consider wine to be an essential part for saying the Havdalah. And that's going to be part of the main idea. And Rabbi Manna is basically saying, says the Haredim, that the wine does not cause a Havdalah blessing to be recited, and it's the Havdalah that can be recited even in the absence over wine. You could do it on Beur, and that's going to be implicit in the words of Rabbi Yossi as well. And that's going to be the idea. Now, the Gemara is going to comment on this because, just to clarify it. And the Gemara is going to say that this is in fact the view of Rabbi Zera himself, and Rabbi Zera says one may recite Havdalah over Beur, but we are required to go from place to place for the sake of hearing Kiddush over wine. In other words, that if you don't have wine for Kiddush, it's not available, that you even need to go from place to place to go do it. And that he's holding that Kiddush cannot be recited over bread or beer. And he's saying that you have to really even travel all around to try to go hear it. That's, by the way, when wine was scarce and expensive, that's going to be part of the custom on why Kiddush was made at the synagogue on Shabbat, because that way you could guarantee that you would hear it and you would cover the Kiddush for everyone. So it's very serious not to have the wine for Kiddush, although it's not necessarily the halacha l'maisa, but there is a point about how essential Kiddush is to wine and the connection with the bread and we were learning about this before, about how it's deeply connected in chapter 6 to the actual creation itself and how humanity interacts with the world. So there's a lot of symbolism and meaning to it. And the Gemara now is going to talk about a case where wine is not available for Kiddush. And Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Bun, says they are accustomed there in Bavel. That is a place where there's no wine for Kiddush, and a prayer leader would pass before the ark, and he would say one blessing, abridgment of 7, and conclude it with the phrase, "Blessed are you, Hashem, who sanctifies Israel on the Sabbath day." And this enables the illiterate members of the congregation who have not recited the evening Shemona Esrei and will not be hearing Kiddush to fulfill the basic biblical requirement to remember the Sabbath day. Now, the Gemara is going to go and analyze the position of Bet Shammai and really try to dig into the guts of it. And we are going to continue that in part 2 on this shiur. So there's a lot going on. This ultimately is going to be where, does the day come first and the wine bring it in? Or is it going to be the Kiddush that's bringing in the day? And the recognition of all of this is going to be what's bringing in the day. In other words, how are we recognizing the day? We all agree that, and Hillel and Bet Shammai agrees that, you need Havdalah to end all of this, and you need Havdalah to bring it out, and there has to be a separation. No disagreement there. But what exactly is going to be the mechanism that brings this in? That's going to be the question here. And later on in chapter 8, we're going to be getting into what about the meal itself, and how is it going to work with the wine, and is the what's going to be the order of it with washing the hands and the bread and trying not to make a hefsek and everything else. So hefsek is also going to be a part of this. So there's a lot of detail going on over here, and the question is what's going to be happening with the prayer on Friday night, and you do Marv, and then you're in a synagogue, and then you're going to come home and you're going to do Kiddush. What's going to bring in what? So there's a lot going on here. Have a great day.